July 7, 1968. In a Harlem church packed with killers, Frank Lucas walked in late and did something that made grown mob bosses feel real fear. He opened a briefcase and placed $100,000 in cash on Bumpy Johnson's body, an act so bold it stopped time and rewrote the rules of power. No one reached for a gun. No one spoke. So what kind of man scares the underworld into silence at a funeral? The official word came down fast and without ceremony: heart attack. That was all Harlem was given. No warning, no long illness, no public decline. One moment Bumpy Johnson was alive. The next he was gone. A king erased in the quietest way possible. For a neighborhood that had learned to read power the way sailors read weather, that silence was unsettling. Harlem had seen men die violently. It understood gunshots, arrests, prison sentences, and betrayals. What it wasn't prepared for was the sudden absence of gravity, an empire losing its center without so much as a tremor. By sunrise on July 7, 1968, the news was everywhere. It moved faster than newspapers, faster than radio. It passed from doormen to barbers, from club owners to numbers runners, from street corners to private dining rooms downtown. Everyone heard the same thing, but not in the same way. Some were told before dawn. Others didn't hear until mid-morning. A few claimed they knew before anyone else. Memory would blur later. The only part that stayed consistent was the outcome: Bumpy Johnson was dead. Harlem didn't mourn right away. It assessed. Power doesn't disappear when a man dies. It pauses. It waits. And in that pause, every ambitious man starts listening for the sound of opportunity. There was no succession plan anyone could point to. No announcement. No named heir. Bumpy had ruled Harlem for decades through balance between the streets and the Italians, between violence and restraint, between presence and absence. He never crowned anyone publicly, never put a hand on a shoulder and said, "This is the next king." That ambiguity had kept the peace while he was alive. Now it created a vacuum. By early morning, phones were ringing across New York. Quiet calls, short conversations, questions without answers. Who was closest to him? Who controlled what? Who moved money and who just carried it? Frank Lucas received the news early. Exactly when depends on who tells the story. Some say he got the call before sunrise. Others insist it was closer to 7. What matters isn't the minute on the clock, but the position he was in when the call came. Frank was known. Everyone in Harlem recognized him. They'd seen him behind Bumpy, beside Bumpy, a half step back, never speaking unless spoken to. He was the driver, the man who opened doors, the one who carried bags, arranged meetings, handled errands. 15 years in Bumpy's orbit, close enough to feel the heat, never close enough to cast a shadow. What Frank was not known as was a leader. He didn't have a crew with a name. He didn't run a flashy operation. He didn't hold court in nightclubs or pose for photographs. To most of Harlem, Frank Lucas was familiar and forgettable. A supporting character in a story everyone assumed had already been written. That assumption began to crack as the morning wore on. By mid-morning, it was clear the funeral would not be a simple farewell. The guest list told the real story. Italian bosses confirmed attendance. Harlem crews planned to sit up front. Politicians and community figures prepared statements. People who owed Bumpy favors and people who feared him all found reasons to be present. The funeral was becoming something else entirely: an audit of power. Every seat in the front rows of Abyssinian Baptist Church would be watched. Who sat where? Who arrived with whom? Who spoke? Who didn't? In a world where authority was rarely written down, funerals were where the ledger was balanced. Some expected chaos. Others expected violence. But most expected a challenge, someone stepping forward, someone making a claim. The only question was who would be reckless enough to try. Frank Lucas was not on that list. As plans were made and alliances quietly tested, Frank said very little. He didn't call meetings. He didn't issue instructions. He didn't rush to reassure anyone. To the outside world, he appeared to be doing exactly what everyone expected: nothing. That quiet fed the assumption that he would remain what he had always been: useful, loyal, replaceable. By late morning, the narrative had settled. Harlem would bury its king, then watch the Italians tighten their grip. Or maybe a local crew would make a move and force a fight. Either way, the city would change hands loudly, violently, and in full view. No one considered the possibility that the moment of transfer might come without a single raised voice. The irony was that Frank Lucas understood something most of them did not. Funerals weren't about grief. They were about memory, and memory was power. Who you honored, how you honored them, and what you were willing to risk in front of witnesses. As the church prepared to open its doors, Harlem believed it knew how this day would end. It believed the story would follow familiar rules. Men would posture. Threats would be implied. The strongest would eventually reveal themselves. What Harlem didn't yet understand was that the most dangerous move of the day would not be loud, violent, or obvious. It would be quiet. And it would happen before anyone realized the game had already changed. Frank Lucas arrived late. That much nearly everyone agrees on. The doors of Abyssinian Baptist Church were already closed. The pews filled the front rows, occupied by men who understood hierarchy the way accountants understand numbers. The service had begun. Hymns had been sung. The room had settled into that heavy formal stillness reserved for moments when history feels close enough to touch. Then the doors opened. Frank did not rush. He did not apologize. He moved at an unhurried pace that immediately drew attention precisely because it seemed out of place. In a room where everyone was watching everyone else, lateness was a statement even if no one could agree later whether it was deliberate or simply how the morning unfolded. He wore black, suit tie fedora. Conservative, almost severe. No jewelry, no entourage, no visible weapon. Just a briefcase in his right hand held low, close to the leg, the way men carried things they did not intend to put down. Some heads turned, most did not. Frank Lucas was known, but he was not anticipated. To many in the room, he registered as part of the background another man who had worked for Bumpy, another familiar face in a sea of familiar faces. He did not draw the kind of attention that usually preceded disruption. That would change. Frank did not take a seat. He did not linger along the aisle or exchange nods. He walked forward past the front rows toward the casket. This alone was unusual. Proximity mattered in rooms like this. Who approached the body and when was never random. He placed the briefcase on the floor beside the casket. There is disagreement about what happened next in exact sequence. Some say he opened it immediately. Others insist there was a pause long enough for the room to notice, short enough that no one reacted. What remains consistent across accounts is what people remember seeing when the case was opened. Cash. Stacks of bills. Neatly arranged. Uniform. The kind of money that did not come from a pocket or a passing gesture. This was not a donation folded into an envelope. It was a display. Most people recall the number as $100,000. There is no official inventory, no photograph, no receipt. The figure survives because it was repeated, because it made sense, because it felt correct in the context of the moment. Whether it was exactly that amount mattered less than what the room understood it to represent. Frank lifted the money one stack at a time and placed it on Bumpy Johnson's body. No one interrupted him. That absence became the detail people fixated on later. Not the money, not the audacity. The silence. A room filled with men who had ordered killings, who had started wars over, less watched without speaking, as a subordinate did something no subordinate was supposed to do. There were opportunities to stop him. Plenty of them. A step forward, a hand on the arm. A word. None came. Frank's posture never changed. He did not look around to gauge reaction. He did not hurry, nor did he linger. When he finished, he stood still for a moment that felt longer than it was. Then he turned. What he said next depends on who you ask. Some remember words about respect. Others recall him invoking Bumpy's name and legacy. A few insist he said almost nothing at all, that his mouth moved, but the sound of blood in their ears drowned out whatever was spoken. The most common version describes a short statement. Direct, measured, not a speech, not a eulogy. Something closer to a declaration than an explanation. What matters is not the phrasing, but the effect. When Frank finished speaking, no one responded. Not immediately. Not reflexively. The men in the front rows, those most accustomed to asserting dominance, did not stand. They did not object. They did not issue threats disguised as condolences. They sat still, absorbing the implications. In the economy of power, reaction time is everything. Silence can mean uncertainty. Uncertainty can mean fear. Frank Lucas closed the briefcase, lifted it, and stepped back. Only then did people begin to breathe again. The service continued, but the tone had shifted. The room was no longer focused solely on the man in the casket. Attention had fractured. Conversations would resume later in private. Decisions would be made behind closed doors, but the reference point had been set. A line had been crossed in full view of witnesses. In the days and years that followed, accounts of that moment would diverge. People would argue about how much money there was, about whether Frank had planned it weeks in advance or decided that morning, about whether he had intended to challenge anyone at all. But no one ever seriously disputed the core fact Frank Lucas placed a large sum of cash on Bumpy Johnson's body in front of everyone who mattered, and no one stopped him. That detail survived because it explained everything that came next. In a world governed by violence, the most powerful signal that day was restraint. The briefcase did not announce Frank Lucas as king. It did something far more dangerous. It forced every other player in the room to decide whether they were willing to challenge him. They chose not to, at least not then. By the time the casket was closed and the mourners began to file out, Harlem had already begun to adjust. Not with celebration, not with open allegiance, but with calculation. Because everyone understood the same thing as they stepped back into the sunlight. Whatever that briefcase had represented, it had changed the balance. And the consequences of that silence were only beginning to unfold. If Frank Lucas had miscalculated, the correction should have come quickly. That was how the underworld enforced order. Bold moves demanded immediate consequences. A challenge left unanswered was usually an invitation to violence. A man who overreached at a funeral was not afforded patience. Harlem's history was filled with examples of ambition ending abruptly and publicly. Everyone who mattered understood that rule. But the hours passed and nothing happened. The first night came and went without a gunshot, without a warning, without a car idling outside Frank's building. By morning, the streets looked exactly the same. Stores opened on schedule and numbers runners took bets like it was any other day. Music drifted from apartment windows and traffic moved along 7th Avenue. On the surface, Harlem behaved as if no line had been crossed. That absence was what unsettled people. Silence after provocation was never accidental in this world. It meant decisions were being weighed. By the second day, attention shifted from what had occurred inside the church to what had not happened afterward. There was no retaliation, no public challenge, no visible attempt to reassert control. Men trained to recognize weakness found only restraint. Restraint was dangerous. It suggested calculation rather than confusion, intention rather than fear. The longer it lasted, the more weight it carried. Phones rang instead of guns firing. Quiet calls were placed carefully, conversations held behind closed doors and never repeated word for word. No one later claimed responsibility for starting them. The contents of those conversations were never recorded, yet the pattern was unmistakable. Information was being requested, not orders issued. The same questions surfaced repeatedly. Who had Frank Lucas spoken to before the funeral, and how much money did he actually control? Was he backed by someone invisible, or had he acted entirely alone in a business governed by reputation? Uncertainty was corrosive. Frank Lucas had introduced a variable no one could immediately solve, and no one wanted to be the first to guess wrong. Killing Frank outright might have been simple. Living with the consequences of killing him was not. Removing him too quickly carried its own risks. It risked validating the move he had made in public. It risked turning the silence in the church into recognition rather than hesitation. It risked confirming that power had already shifted. Frank appeared to understand this, whether by instinct or design. He did not retreat or surround himself with visible protection. He continued moving through Harlem as he always had. He walked the streets, drove his routes, and appeared where people expected to see him. Those sightings traveled quickly through quiet conversations. The same observations were repeated again and again. He's still here. He hasn't disappeared. He looks calm. Calm unsettled people more than arrogance. Rivals expected panic, overreaction, or signs of doubt after such a public gamble. Frank displayed none of it. He did not boast or attempt to explain himself. He did not repeat the gesture that had frozen the church. He allowed the moment to stand on its own. That restraint forced everyone else into a waiting game. No one wanted to move first, not the Italian leadership who understood the cost of misreading Harlem, not the local crews who had watched ambitious men die for less. Each hour without action raised the stakes. Every delay made intervention more dangerous. Time itself began working in Frank's favor. By the third day, the conversation shifted noticeably. It was no longer about whether Frank Lucas should be dealt with. It became a question of when and by whom. That change mattered more than any threat. Power was rarely seized outright. More often, it was granted by delay. Every hour Frank remained untouched added weight to his claim. Every day that passed rewrote the memory of the funeral. What had once seemed reckless began to feel inevitable. Observers quietly reinterpreted what they had witnessed. Perhaps Frank had not been reckless at all. Perhaps the briefcase had never been a gamble. Rumors filled the gaps left by missing facts. Some claimed Frank possessed far more money than anyone realized, while others whispered about unseen guarantees. None of these stories needed to be true. They only needed to be possible. Frank's greatest advantage was not what he owned. It was what others could not disprove. Behind closed doors, options were weighed carefully. A quiet removal. A public humiliation. A negotiated settlement disguised as peace. Each path carried risk. The city was watching, even if it did not realize it was watching. Any move against Frank would be read not just as an action, but as a verdict on what that funeral moment had meant. And verdicts once delivered could not be appealed. Frank continued as he always had. He checked on operations, met with trusted figures, and listened more than he spoke. He made no public announcements. He did not claim Bumpy Johnson's title. He did not deny it either. That ambiguity became its own shield. Men who might have challenged him hesitated. Each delay narrowed their options and raised the cost of action. Too early would look like fear, too late like desperation. By the end of the week, a quiet recognition settled in. Not agreement, not loyalty, but acknowledgement. Whatever Frank Lucas had done at that funeral had not collapsed. It had held. Power tests were never about force alone. They were about nerve, about who could stand still the longest while everyone else calculated risk. Frank Lucas stood still, and as long as no one touched him, the silence following him through Harlem grew heavier, until it no longer felt like hesitation. It felt like acceptance. The city had not crowned a new king, but it had done something far more consequential. It had chosen not to challenge him, not yet. The meeting did not happen in a public place, and it did not happen with witnesses who would later speak on record. Accounts differed on the location, the attendees, and even the order of events. What remained consistent was the outcome. There was no confrontation, no raised voices, no visible show of force. The conversation was described later as direct, short, and necessary. Whatever was said, both sides left the room understanding the same thing. Frank Lucas had not been removed, not yet. What followed was not a treaty, at least not one written down. It was a pause commonly remembered as a 6-month window. Time in this case became the currency both sides agreed to trade. For Frank, 6 months was not protection, it was probation. The expectation was simple: hold Harlem together, make money quietly, and avoid creating problems that would invite intervention. For the Italians, 6 months was a test. If Frank failed, they would step in with justification. If he succeeded, they would be forced to reconsider assumptions that had held for decades. Frank did not announce the arrangement to anyone. There was no speech, no message sent through intermediaries, no public acknowledgement that anything had changed. Harlem was not informed that it was being watched. Instead, Frank focused on routine. He kept the same hours, used the same routes, and met with the same people. Stability became his loudest statement. He did not expand his territory. He did not challenge neighboring operations. He did not make moves that would draw attention or provoke response. Money continued to flow, but it flowed quietly. Operations were tightened, not multiplied. People were paid on time, and problems were handled without spectacle. This was not how power was usually displayed. There were no ceremonies, no titles handed out, no visible signs of leadership changing hands. Control was exercised through consistency. Frank made himself predictable. In a world where unpredictability often meant danger, predictability signaled authority. It told people that someone was paying attention. Rivals waited for mistakes. They expected overreach, arrogance, or impatience. What they saw instead was restraint. Weeks passed without incident. The absence of chaos began to feel deliberate. The city adjusted slowly and quietly to a new rhythm. Frank did not demand loyalty. He did not require public acknowledgement. He allowed people to choose stability over uncertainty on their own terms. That choice mattered. It created compliance without confrontation. People aligned themselves with Frank not because they were ordered to, but because nothing compelled them to resist. Behind the scenes, the 6-month clock kept ticking. Every week without disruption narrowed the options for intervention. Every month made removal more complicated. By the 3rd month, the question had shifted. It was no longer whether Frank could hold Harlem together. It became whether anyone else could do it better without tearing it apart. Frank continued to avoid visibility. He did not indulge in displays of wealth or seek validation. He let others underestimate him. That restraint was interpreted differently depending on who was watching. Some saw discipline, others saw caution. A few mistook it for weakness. Frank did not correct those assumptions. He allowed them to circulate. Misinterpretation became another layer of insulation. The 6-month understanding was never referenced openly. There were no reminders, no check-ins, no formal evaluations. The assessment was made through observation alone. Did the streets remain quiet? Did money continue moving? Did law enforcement attention remain minimal? Those were the only metrics that mattered. By the 5th month, intervention no longer looked clean. Any attempt to dislodge Frank would disrupt an ecosystem that had adjusted around him. Stability had become his defense. What had started as a temporary pause now carried consequences. Acting against Frank would mean explaining why order was being broken, not restored. That calculation weighed heavily. Power prefers clean moves. It avoids actions that require explanation. Frank understood this without ever stating it. He stayed within the margins, never crossing lines that would force a response. Control remained procedural, not theatrical. The 6-month window closed without announcement. There was no signal that it had ended. It simply expired into reality. Frank Lucas was still there. Harlem was still functioning. And nothing had justified removing him. No one declared him king. No one needed to. The city had already adjusted its behavior. Power had been established not through confrontation but through endurance. Not through demand, but through routine. What mattered was not what had been agreed upon in private. What mattered was what had happened afterward. And what had happened was simple. Frank Lucas had been given time. He had used it. That time changed the balance, quietly, permanently. For years, Frank Lucas remained invisible by design. He made more money than most men in New York, yet refused to display it. In a world where attention attracted bullets and indictments, invisibility was discipline. Frank watched others fail that test. He saw men announce themselves with cars, jewelry, and noise, then disappear just as loudly. Wealth he believed was safest when it was mistaken for absence. His name rarely surfaced in public conversation. Harlem's product was purer, cheaper, and more consistent than anything else on the street, but no one could point to a single man behind it. That distance protected him. Frank lived comfortably but cautiously. He avoided patterns that drew notice and places that invited scrutiny. For years, he did everything right. Then came March 8, 1971. Madison Square Garden was filled beyond capacity for the Ali Frazier fight. It was not just a sporting event, but a gathering of influenced celebrities, politicians, financiers, and men whose power did not appear in headlines. Ringside seats were a statement. Frank Lucas took one. He did not blend in. He wore a full-length chinchilla coat, dark and unmistakable, a garment that drew the eye in a room already saturated with wealth. In a crowd where discretion was the uniform, the coat broke rank. It was not the price of the coat that mattered. It was the choice to wear it there. Frank had stepped into visibility. Across the arena, law enforcement noticed. Investigators had tracked the results of an unseen operation for years but lacked a focal point. That night they found one. The coat provided something rare, a contradiction. A man without a known income source displaying wealth that could not be explained. It did not prove a crime, but it justified attention. From that moment forward, Frank Lucas was no longer a rumor. He became a subject. Surveillance began quietly. There was no arrest, no confrontation, no warning. Investigators watched and waited, documenting movements and associations with patients learned from previous failures. Frank continued operating as before. He did not sense the shift immediately because the streets still functioned the same way. Money still moved and people still answered to him. But the silence had changed direction. Financial records were examined. Property purchases were revisited. Transactions that once looked unconnected were now studied as parts of a system. The investigation did not move quickly. It moved carefully. Empires built in silence were dismantled the same way. Years passed before action was taken. By then, the case no longer depended on speculation. It depended on documents, numbers, and testimony. In 1995, Frank Lucas was arrested at his home in New Jersey. Authorities seized cash, drugs, and records that confirmed what had long been suspected. The quiet operation was no longer invisible. The empire did not collapse in a single moment. It unraveled piece by piece methodically as supply lines were exposed and protections failed. What secrecy had built exposure dismantled. Frank faced a sentence that effectively erased the rest of his life. The scale of the operation left little room for denial. Silence, which had once preserved him, now guaranteed nothing. He chose to cooperate. Frank provided information few others could. His testimony reached beyond his own organization, touching networks that had operated undisturbed for decades. Corruption that had existed as rumor became record. Arrests followed. Entire units were dismantled. Cases that had stalled for years were reopened and resolved. The legal outcomes reframed Frank's role. His sentence was reduced significantly, a result later attributed to the breadth of his cooperation. Motivation was never fully explained. Frank served years in prison and emerged into a different world. The drug trade had grown more violent and less organized. Harlem had changed. He lived quietly afterward. He spoke selectively, sometimes to warn others, sometimes to explain himself. History listened without forgiving. Some remembered Frank Lucas as a criminal who profited from destruction. Others remembered him as a man who outthought systems designed to exclude him. Both narratives persisted. Yet nearly every account returned to the same moment. Not the arrest, not the testimony, the coat. That was when invisibility ended. That was when consequence began. Frank had once believed that real power stayed unseen. For years his life supported that belief. Then for one night, he stepped into the light. The cost was everything. The $100,000 placed in Bumpy Johnson's casket appears in no official report. There is no photograph entered into evidence, no receipt, no sworn testimony confirming the act. On paper, the moment never existed. And yet nearly every serious account of Harlem after 1968 returns to that morning. Not to the cause of death, not to the sermon, but to the silence that followed a decision no one interrupted. That silence altered behavior. Frank Lucas was never formally crowned. No title was announced, no authority publicly transferred, no hierarchy rewritten in words. The absence of ceremony was itself the message. Harlem adjusted anyway. People changed how they moved, who they answered to, and which assumptions they stopped testing. Power does not always require acknowledgement to operate. For years, Frank Lucas remained largely unseen. He did not demand loyalty or issue proclamations, and he never needed to explain himself. Routine replaced rhetoric. That quiet period is often misread. Some call it brilliance, others call it luck. What cannot be disputed is that the city complied. Compliance did not come from fear alone. It came from predictability, from the absence of disruption, from the sense that challenging the new order would cost more than accepting it. Stability became its own argument. Then came visibility. One coat, one night, one moment where discretion broke rank. That was all it took. The attention Frank had avoided for years began moving toward him with patience and precision. Not with headlines or raids, but with files, surveillance, and time. The same silence that once protected him now worked in reverse. The collapse that followed was not dramatic. It was administrative, procedural, and thorough. Empires built quietly tend to fall the same way. Frank Lucas cooperated when the margins disappeared. His testimony exposed systems that had survived on shared silence for decades. The record reflects outcomes, not intentions. History often asks whether Frank Lucas was a mastermind or a criminal. That question is comfortable because it simplifies what is harder to confront. Power does not always look like genius or villainy. Sometimes power looks like a room full of men deciding not to act. The defining moment of this story was not the money, the empire, or the arrests. It was a briefcase opened in a church and the collective choice to let it happen. No violence followed because none was required. That moment did not prove Frank Lucas's strength. It revealed everyone else's calculation. Power does not always announce itself with force. Sometimes it waits to see who dares to stand unchallenged and who decides it is safer not to. The city never recorded that decision officially, but it lived with its consequences for years. Some stories end with verdicts and sentences. Others end with behavior quietly changing direction. This was one of those stories. The file closes without a final judgment. There is no clean moral, no resolution that fits neatly at the bottom of the page. Only a moment history chose not to write down. So here is the question that remains: did Frank Lucas become powerful because no one stopped him that day? Or did no one stop him because power had already changed hands? If you want more cases history never wrote down properly, subscribe. Some stories weren't meant to be remembered, but their consequences never stopped echoing.